environmental justice. And we are really thrilled to have with us Professor Marcos Luna. I'm Pat Gazemba from co-chair of SAFE. You'll meet Cindy Keegan, the other co-chair of SAFE, in the second part of this program. Let me deal with a few housekeeping issues at the very beginning. First, we will be recording this meeting, so if you don't want to be recorded, I suggest that you leave the meeting at this point. And then the other housekeeping issues are, it looks as if all of you have been on Zoom before, so you can, in the upper right-hand corner of the image of you, click on the three dots and there'll be a rename function that will come up, and we'd really appreciate it if you'd type in your name and the municipality that you're from, and perhaps the organization that you're working with. We will also be keeping everybody on mute for the presentation, and we ask you that you keep your questions until the end of the presentation by Professor Luna. We will then have a question and answer period of 20 minutes. And we ask you, if you have a question, to go to the chat and just type in raised hand. Not the question, just raised hand. Your name will be attached to that, and we will call on you in the order in which you typed in your raised hand note to us. Then we just want to remind you that if you have more than one question, we certainly encourage you to ask it, but we're going to allow everybody to ask one question first, and then we'll come back to people who have secondary questions for Professor Luna. Again, I want to welcome you all, and we thank you for coming to join us. We especially thank members of our state legislature who are here with us tonight. Our own Senator Joan Lovely is here. And a colleague of hers in the Massachusetts Senate, Senator Will Brownsberger, is also here, and Representative Paul Tucker from Salem is also joining us tonight. I want to say about Representative Tucker and Senator Lovely, they have been staunch allies with SAFE regarding environmental justice. They were both co-sponsors of legislation, of bills that included environmental justice that were in the House and in the Senate. So we have two great environmental justice allies representing us in Salem, and we feel very fortunate to have them. Okay, let's get going. I just want to say that SAFE ran its first program on environmental justice in 2004. So here we are 16 years later, we're still at it. As an environmental justice and gateway city community, Salem has a heightened stake in having this session of the Massachusetts legislature pass and the governor sign meaningful EJ legislation as part of a climate bill. We know that only legislation that is enforceable will bring justice to environmentally challenged communities such as ours. Salem and SAFE are very fortunate to have a remarkable ally in Salem State University Professor Marcos Luna, coordinator of the Graduate GIS program in the Department of Geography and Sustainability at Salem State. Dr. Luna provided data for the EJ amendment that passed the House unanimously. Dr. Luna knows environmental issues intimately. He works in Salem, he lives in East Boston, and he is on the board of Green Roots in Chelsea. We are delighted to have Professor Luna talking with us tonight. Thanks a lot, Marcos, for being with us.
Thank you, Pat. It's my pleasure to be here. And I want to extend a thank you to SAFE for hosting this meeting to talk about this really important issue. So I'm going to be showing a presentation. I'm going to share my screen just right now. And there we go. Okay. So the purpose of the presentation is to give a quick primer on what environmental justice is about broadly, what brings us to this point to be asking for legislation to be passed on it, and what that looks like in terms of the details of what this particular iteration might be, and why we think it works for what's going on in the state. So let's start off with the why of the thing. So why environmental justice? What is this thing that we're talking about? And so essentially it comes down to a very simple situation, not simple in effect, but simple in terms of stating it. And that's simply that people of color, low-income people are disproportionately exposed to and affected by all kinds of environmental burdens. And they also tend to be less likely to enjoy environmental benefits. And so that's kind of the underlying issue at hand when we talk about environmental justice. And that's where we're starting from. And so the evidence for this is very clear. We have research on this issue, both by government agencies as well as by academic researchers going back 40 years at this point, looking at a variety of kinds of environmental burdens that you can imagine. Currently, we see that when you look at where you have polluting facilities like toxic release inventory sites, essentially large businesses that have large volumes of emissions, you'll find that people of color tend to be disproportionately represented in the communities immediately around them. When we looked at air pollution, we find that Blacks and Hispanics tend to be more highly exposed to higher concentrations of, for example, fine particulate matter, which is closely tied to a variety of respiratory problems and other kinds of health issues like cancer. People in poverty are more likely to be exposed to it as well, compared to those who are not in poverty. When we look at asthma rates, we find that communities of color have higher rates, higher hospital admissions, higher death rates from asthma, which is a very strongly environmentally influenced disease. When we look at the vulnerable within the vulnerable, like children, we find that Black children in particular tend to have twice as likely rather to have elevated blood lead levels. And now we know, research shows that there's no safe exposure to lead for children. So that's a serious issue. When we look locally in Massachusetts, we find a very similar pattern. We find that air pollution exposure is higher for communities of color, particularly when it comes from traffic-generated air pollution, which is the largest source in Massachusetts, as it is across the Northeast. Recent studies by the Metropolitan Area Planning Council that just came out this year showed that Latinos in particular are twice as likely to live near high pollution traffic corridors compared to whites in the state. Same thing, Asians and Blacks too are overexposed by that comparison. And then again with asthma, we see the same pattern. And this plays out at various geographic scales, and it plays out across the entire country. And so this pattern is what we come to think about when we talk about environmental justice issues. So as I said, this goes back about 40 years at this point of awareness of this particular problem. And it kind of got its legs in the early 1980s with charges of environmental racism, specifically the argument that dumps essentially and other kinds of unwanted land use were being specifically targeted for communities of color, particularly Black communities in the South. And so that this was an expression of racism. And so the movement coalesced around that and began to include more and more communities that are disadvantaged that were noticing similar patterns. And this was followed by studies done by both the federal government as well as a growing number of researchers, And it hit a high point in the early 90s and when President Clinton then in 94 issued an executive order directing federal agencies to incorporate consideration of environmental justice in their actions, specifically targeting consideration for the impacts of projects and decisions that would affect minority populations and low-income populations. And since that time, we currently have over 30 states in the country that have some form of environmental justice policy that is roughly similar to what the federal policy is in terms of where it draws attention to the issue of environmental justice. So here I want to really emphasize that when we talk about environmental justice, we're not talking about just identifying places with high pollution burden. We're specifically talking about public health issues that overlap with civil rights issues. We're talking about issues of discrimination that express themselves through environmental burdens. So environmental justice is about discriminatory processes that lead to unequal environmental burdens, and it's about environmental effects of discrimination itself. So when we're talking about this phenomenon, we want to keep that in mind, that this is what we're about, that we're talking about this intersection of these two issues. And so that's what environmental justice is principally about. So as long as this issue has been raised, the question has always been asked, why are people of color and low-income people disproportionately burdened? Why are they more vulnerable to these things? Why is this happening? Well, for the most part, we understand that this is very similar to what the social determinants of health are. These are essentially the larger forces around us that kind of predetermine and influence what people's life trajectories are going to be like, the things that are sort of out of their control. In this country, as we should all know, there's a long history of legal discrimination in housing, employment, education, healthcare, civic participation, pretty much everything that matters in life. And it's only relatively recently, since the middle of the 20th century, that we've outlawed a lot of these things, but they continue to happen and they operate in de facto ways, right? They're not necessarily legal, but they occur nevertheless. And so these forces mean that there are certain groups, certain populations that are constantly put at a disadvantage, unable to protect themselves in the same way that others might, and also are essentially working uphill all the time. And so these things predispose them to being the victims of unwanted activity, as well as the inability to protect themselves. Now, one way that this expresses itself, and the way that I want to focus on here to kind of illustrate how this plays out, is looking at residential segregation. So I'm a geographer, so I'm always looking for how things play out on the landscape. And this is one material way that we see these kinds of things happen. And it, I think, helps us understand why they turn out this way. So the map in front of you is a map I worked on a while ago, but it's the 2010 census data, and it's focused on eastern Massachusetts, highlighting Essex County. And what you're seeing essentially are the different races of the population spread out across the landscape. Each dot represents 5 people. The yellow or orange dots represent non-Hispanic whites or white people. And then the blues are Hispanic, the green are Black, and the red are non-Hispanic Asian. So this is a rough breakdown demographically. Of course, I'm excluding a lot of people here too, but this is the bulk of the population. So what should be immediately apparent is that most of the dots are yellow or orange, right? Which is not surprising unless the state is white. But what should also be apparent is that the other races, the other groups, are highly clustered in certain areas. You look at Lawrence in the upper left, that blue cluster, and you can see that that Hispanic population is very concentrated in one area. You see a little bit in Haverhill, and if you look a little outside the area to Lowell, you can also see some red in there. It's a larger Asian population there. And then again, down south in Lynn and Salem, you see clusters of blue and a little bit of green. And so this is what segregation looks like. This is what residential segregation looks like. And it turns out that Massachusetts is very segregated residentially. When we drill down further, we can look at Salem, and I'm focusing on Salem because, well, this is SAFE's meeting, so we should look at what's going on the ground here. And we can see again the yellow-orange showing the white population, and then the blue cluster. The most prominent one, of course, there is, if you know Salem, is the Point neighborhood. And the Point neighborhood has a large Hispanic population. You see a few other clusters, but by and large, we see the same level of segregation in Salem that we do in the county as a whole, that we see in the state as a whole. So this is a large-scale pattern that manifests at various scales and regardless of the community you look in almost. It turns out that Massachusetts is distinguished in this sense in terms of the level of segregation. The University of Michigan, its Population Studies Center, regularly puts out reports on the level of segregation. There's multiple ways to measure this. quantitatively. It's not just by looking at a map to look at how things are distributed, but you actually can quantify the level of separation between groups. And what we find is that when we look at the top 100 largest metropolitan areas across the country, we see that Massachusetts cities and metro areas pop out in the top 20 or so. Here, when we're looking at just the segregation between Black and white people in the state, Springfield and the Boston, Cambridge, Quincy area are in the top 20 something. So they're kind of in the 75th, 80th percentile, meaning that they're essentially more segregated than roughly 80 to 75% of the rest of the country. When we look at that, we see a similar pattern play out for the Asian white segregation. It's also particular for Worcester, and but again, Boston shows up. But what will really shine or don't shine is when it comes to white Hispanic segregation. So we see that 5 out of the top 20 most segregated metro areas for Hispanics in the country are in Massachusetts. And so Massachusetts is, by any measure, highly segregated in comparison to other parts of the country. Now, why are they segregated? Well, there's a lot of forces at play that create this. It's not simply that people chose to live where other people were that look like them. We actually have a long history of forces that kind of push people in that particular direction. We have historically policies, law that encouraged people to live separately, to segregate the races. We have the activities and behaviors of individuals like real estate agents intentionally steering people away from certain communities or trying to scare away people out of a community by telling them that undesirable classes were moving in. And of course, we have this major phenomenon of white flight that happened beginning in the 50s and 60s, in which you had white residents, middle class in particular, leaving the downtown urban areas, moving to the suburbs. Now, the one that's hardest to wrap your head around, I think, for a lot of people is that at one time this was legal, that the nation encouraged people to segregate racially. Prior to the Depression, in the 1930s, 1929, if you wanted to buy a house, you pretty much had to come up with either all the money or a big chunk of it ahead of time to buy the house. And in order to encourage housing development, the federal government embarked on a program to essentially insure loans from banks so that they lowered the risk of a bank to make loans to people to buy houses. And so that's kind of the system that we've grown up with today. But when that program was first created in the 1930s, it specifically excluded certain areas, certain communities from being able to take advantage of those subsidized loans, the ones where the risk was taken care of by the federal government. And the government's manual specifically said that areas that had minorities in them were not to be regarded as good bets. And so these were considered high risk or hazardous areas. And so banks were discouraged and prevented even from lending to people in those red areas. And those red areas were almost invariably in the inner cities or were areas with high minorities. And in fact, any place that had minorities moving in could be downgraded. So there was a lot at stake here. And so what happened was, on the plus side, it opened up housing for a lot of people, well, a lot of white people, to move the suburbs into new housing. And we know over the long term, this is really important because buying a house, having a house, is the single most important way that people build wealth in families, is from the appreciation of property. But you had entire classes of people who were completely excluded from participating in this program and were effectively confined to areas that were downgraded in terms of their value and their wealth, so people could not take advantage of those wealth building opportunities. And so this went on for the better part of 3 decades. It wasn't outlawed until 1968. So this had a profound effect in a variety of ways. One is, as I just said, it created this huge gap in generational wealth between races. Second, it set in motion this inertia about where people lived. The same places that are redlined, well, that were redlined in the 30s, a lot of those places are not much different today. In fact, there's a lot of research looking at areas that were redlined originally in the 30s and 40s and seeing that those are places that have been essentially minority for the entire time, for the entire 20th century, and also are areas that suffer worse pollution, that still suffer disinvestment. So this is something that's had a really long shadow in terms of what's happened. But even though that's no longer legal, we still see housing discrimination happening today. the Housing and Redevelopment Department, federal agency, as well as researchers regularly send out surveyors who pose as potential renters or people looking for houses, and demonstrate empirically year after year that there is still active housing discrimination preventing people from buying or renting and getting treated very differently, changing the odds of where people can possibly live. So you have essentially a collective behavior as well as a legacy of legal programs, institutions that have created and reinforced residential segregation over decades, so that it's still the case today. And it happens in a lot of subtle ways too. It's not always that people are actively being malicious or being racist intentionally, but the structure is in place to make it very easy to do that, or to do it by another name. So there's a variety of ways, a variety of structures that are in place already that enable this to be continued. And so this is what we see in the landscape. Now, what does this have to do with environmental justice? Well, the reason I go over this story is because we have to remember that anything that happens on this highly segregated landscape is going to have different impacts by race and by class. Anything you do is going to have to take place either in a white community or not a white community, have to take place in a wealthier community or not a wealthy community because of that segregation. It also means that there's profoundly unequal power across a segregated landscape, right? And so communities that have greater wealth, greater ability to make their voices heard are going to be naturally more protected, right? They're going to be able to fend off things that they don't want to attract things that they want. And so for developers or for others looking to do projects, they're going to get pushed away from those communities naturally. They're going to get pushed to places that are cheaper, lower priced properties, where there's less political power, where there's less organizing, there's less opposition. And so what that's going to do, it's going to reinforce the difference in terms of the distribution of environmental burdens as well as environmental amenities across that landscape. So this is how structural inequality works, and this is the basis of how environmental injustices get created and perpetuated. So environmental justice policy. So we're talking tonight about a pending bill that's in conference, I believe, but, and also as Pat mentioned at the beginning, the effort for EJ legislation has been going on for the better part of 16 years at this point. So this is a long haul effort. But the state has had environmental justice policy actually since 2002, although this was working only at the Executive Office of Environmental Affairs level as a policy there. But in 2017, it was turned into an executive order. And those policies, though, were all pretty consistent. They defined environmental justice communities in the state. And what they did primarily is allow those communities to have more notification when something happened in those communities. It was pretty much the gist of what that policy did. But it was roughly comparable to or roughly consistent with the federal policy in terms of describing what environmental justice is about. The current proposed policy, which is, and I'm referring here to House 4933, I think is the new number in it as it's in conference, defines environmental justice principles. And here it's roughly, again, consistent with federal policy, federal definitions, as well as the previous Massachusetts environmental justice policies that preceded it. One of the things that is different here than in previous policies, and this is the part that I'm more familiar with, this is what I helped out with as a technical expert in advising, was how to define environmental justice communities. So all of the previous state policies define communities demographically in terms of who lives there. Because again, remember that the reason we're looking at it this way is because environmental justice is about discrimination, right? It's about inequitable outcomes that are tied to civil rights issues. So this policy does a similar thing. It defines environmental justice communities at the census block group level based on 3 broad demographic criteria. So we're looking at communities or block groups where the household income is at or below 65% of the statewide median household income. We're looking at communities where 25% or more of residents are lacking English language proficiency, or basically households where no adult speaks English very well. And then we have the criteria of minorities, of proportion of minorities in that community or block group. And this is one that's a little different than the previous policies. So there's 2 levels to it on that one. any community or any block group where 40% or more of the population is minority would automatically be called an environmental justice community. But in cases where in cities or towns where the town as a whole is less than 150% of the statewide median income, so it's not one of the wealthier towns, basically, the threshold for a minority block group is a little lower. It's at 25%, which is like the previous policy. So that two-stage element to minority is kind of an important provision because it's part of the change that happened in terms of trying to address concerns from the previous policies. So what does this look like? So the proposed policy would mean this. Here we have a graph showing the proportions of the population, proportions of block groups in the state that would fall into the various categories. So the first and largest, the gray area, shows that about 56.9, 57% of the state would not be an environmental justice community. So that means about 43% would. The largest single category would be the minority category, but you can see the other ones too. So the way it works is that if any community falls into one or more of the categories, it becomes an environmental justice community. When we look at it as a map, we see this. We see that most of the state is not, right? So the population centers are, focused in around the large cities. So that's where you see a lot of these designations. But you can see the yellow spread across most of the state where you have the minority status, and the second largest is the income status, which you see a lot in Western Mass. The communities that fall within this, within these criteria that land as environmental justice are roughly consistent with what's been designated before, although this time we had a lot more input from a variety of stakeholders across the state who had input upon which communities should or shouldn't be included based upon their history, based upon what we know about what's happened on the ground, and which communities we know are particularly vulnerable. So this particular choice of criteria is not arbitrary. It's actually part of a collaborative process talking with a lot of different groups. Now, it's very different from what preceded it. So in 2017, we had an executive order from then Governor Deval Patrick that specified in the EJ policy. And that one was very different because the income criterion was more expansive. So the map on the bottom of your screen and the graph on the bottom are what that previous policy would have looked like. So under that one, you can see that about a third of the state would have qualified as an environmental justice community based on income alone. But overall, close to about 2/3 of the state would fall into some EJ designation. So it's pretty expansive. So that seemed to be problematic to a lot of people. So the new policy, or the proposed policy, is considerably pared back compared to this one, to the one that's current right now from the executive order. Now, one of the things that was discussed in designing this particular criteria for an EJ policy was a concern about communities or block groups that probably aren't really going to face environmental justice challenges. And so in order to address that, we looked at the wealthiest communities in the state. And so this is a screenshot from that web-based report and an interactive map. It was included in the Zoom invitation. And what we're showing here are, again, the wealthiest communities in the state. And we wanted to be able to remove, essentially, communities that fall into those areas. And so here is an example of the red areas are block groups that would previously have been incorporated as environmental justice communities that are inside those wealthy blue communities. And so those have been removed. And so in the process of creating the current proposed policy and defining environmental justice communities, we made it more efficient. We tightened it up. So it eliminated a lot of those kind of those areas that people felt weren't really going to be included. We couldn't get them all because it's kind of hard to define a policy that's that specific without making it unwieldy or complicated. But overall, what the proposed policy does is it does a few things. One is it sticks to the spirit of what environmental justice is about by identifying demographic groups that are most vulnerable to environmental injustice based on what we know from research and experience. The way it works is, in addition to identifying those communities, what do they get out of that? Well, in cases where there's going to be some kind of project that has significant environmental impact, and that's legalese for very specific circumstances, if it happens in or within a mile of an environmental justice designated community, then that can trigger an environmental impact report. And in that report, the proponent or the applicant has to look at the proposal from an environmental justice perspective to consider how will it affect these people in particular. Will it exacerbate any kind of public health problems that they're having? Will it add to the load? Is there something unequal about the process? And in addition, for communities that have a sizable community of limited English speakers, it requires that there's more effort into interpretation and translation services so that they can actually participate in the process. This is an important component of that. If it's an air-related project that has a significant impact, then it's a 5-mile radius essentially around those communities. So it's under those particular circumstances that something is triggered essentially. Again, only for anything that has a significant environmental impact. And please don't ask me to define that because I'm not a lawyer. But that's what the law, as currently the bill rather, specifies. I think that it improves on the previous EJ policies I said before because it's more efficient in the terms of filtering out communities that previously would have been included, but again are in these wealthier communities that are very unlikely to face environmental justice issues. But lastly, the proposal also has some flexibility built into it. So in cases where you have communities that are smaller than a census block group, and census block groups are essentially what they sound like. They're a group of blocks that hold roughly about 3,000 people, but some communities, particularly in rural parts of the state, can be very small, and they may get swallowed up in a larger block group, and you may have a community that should be included but hasn't because of the data doesn't allow you to do that. There is a mechanism to allow those communities to petition to be designated as an environmental justice community, so the secretary can approve that, Secretary of EOA. In addition, the secretary also has the authority to delist communities that otherwise are automatically listed as environmental justice communities, to remove them from that because they may not belong there. So there is in fact a process and a flexibility to allow both for inclusion and exclusion of communities depending on the circumstances. So I'm done with my portion of the presentation, so I guess I'm ready for questions if people have them.
Michael Elkin, you're the first one up. If you could unmute yourself.
No, it's my husband's line. So I was wondering if this passes, does that mean that, I know it hasn't quite gone online yet, but does that mean they could decommission the Weymouth compressor plant if this law is passed?
So the law and as it's written does not specify any particular outcome. So what it does is it kind of works the way that NEPA works, or even National Environmental Policy Act, or MEPA, Massachusetts Environmental Policy Act. It requires that people go through a process of review to consider what the possible outcomes and what alternatives could be. So it requires that there's more consideration into any kind of project, but again, only in the situation where that project is going to have a significant impact as determined by regulation, and if it's nearby a designated environmental justice community.
It is.
Okay.
But that's only going forward. They couldn't address things that have happened in the past.
I don't know the answer to that question. I doubt it, but I don't know.
Thanks.
So I see Nina Cohen, raise her hand.
Hi. My question is whether the law has any provisions that fund research or technical advice for residents who are being presented with a proposal by a proponent but may not have the scientific expertise to rebut a presumption that they are granted, to make a little fairer playing field?
There is no provision that I saw in the bill that specifies that particular assistance. What it does mostly is makes the proponent or applicant make extra work and outreach to those communities to provide them with opportunities to read the materials, to engage at workshops or at presentations so that they can be a part of the process. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure I looked over it again. I didn't see anything there that specifically said that assistance we offered. It is part of a larger climate bill. So the EJ component is actually an amendment to this larger climate bill. And so within the climate bill, there are other provisions that they don't mandate, as far as I understand, but they do encourage that resources be directed to environmental justice communities where possible. But the specific question about scientific support, for example, on a question that's before them, I did not see that, no.
Pat, I think you're up next.
Marcos, I wonder if you could sort of deconstruct for us an example that I have heard a number of times from legislators that of course, the current executive order has real problems in terms of allowing for, let's say, a community like Lexington to be an environmental justice community because they have a high population of minority residents, largely from Asia, Southeast Asia. And so how have you helped craft guardrails that are really going to do that? I wondered if you'd talk about the limited English proficiency, the economic status in terms of household income, and issues of, and then another one that's been discussed, which is the possibility of saying any groups with over 50% of the population having a bachelor's degree or higher. Can you talk a little bit about that? How you thought about communities like Lexington?
So I think the biggest, so that was a big issue in terms of the group. It wasn't just me. This is a large group of participants in terms of trying to craft something that addressed those concerns that had come up before with the other policies. And so part of the answer was to try to, as I said, tighten up the criteria to make a higher threshold of inclusion, particularly for the minority category. So you see that the initial threshold is like 40% for minority. And minority is a really broad classification to begin with, which is always challenging because it includes with it not just Black and Hispanic, but Asian is a huge category of different, it depends where in Asia you're coming from. And so with different Asian different people of Asian descent are going to be coming from different parts of Asia and have different wealth and power and different contexts. So the thresholds are higher. So we could see we made a definite improvement about what had been before. But in the cases where you couldn't do it that easily because you have some communities like in our Lexington, that have high South Asian populations, people of India in particular, they are going to get pulled in regardless just because they're extraordinarily high populations. So in those cases, then we have provisions in the bill that allow the secretary to essentially remove those communities because they are highly educated, because they're pretty wealthy, and they don't fit any kind of typical understanding of what environmental justice is about. So it leaves that responsibility to the secretary in consultation with an environmental justice advisory council to be created as well. But I think what we were trying to balance was the complexity of the criteria with what we were trying to achieve. And so we wanted to make sure that it wasn't a black box, that people could look at the policy and understand what was going on, like why some communities got included and why others didn't, but again, allowing for the possibility that, sometimes you get things slip in. So you might think of them as collateral beneficiaries, right? We didn't intend them to benefit from this, but we do have a mechanism to address that. So it's not the end of the world if they're included. And plus, consider that nothing really gets triggered until something happens, something of significance happens. And so I imagine that those communities are probably going to be protected in other ways for the most part. They're unlikely to be the target of development or activities that they're probably not going to be happy with anyways. But as far as the criteria goes, those are the two sides of that. We have higher thresholds, and then we have a mechanism to control for that after it's been designated. But we wanted to have something that was understandable to most people so that it wasn't inscrutable.
Paul Tucker, you're up next. If you could unmute yourself.
Dr. Luna, thank you for this and the presentation. I just had a quick question. You mentioned that there were 30 other states that have some form of environmental justice legislation. Is there any state that you would point to in particular that's really gotten it right, something that the legislature will be able to look at? And sometimes it's best not to reinvent the wheel. Is there anybody that's really doing it right that we could look at?
So to clarify, so thank you for that question. There's 30 other states have policies, not legislation. So that they're all over the place in terms, some of them are embedded within one agency. Some of them are also executive orders, some of them. California probably has the most comprehensive model of how to deal with it, but California is also very complicated because they kind of went a different route in terms of addressing it, and they sort of, I don't want to say abandoned, but they're doing a more environmental health focused approach, and they're looking mostly just to find areas of high pollutant burden. So I wouldn't even call it, it's not quite the same animal in a way, but they also have the most sophisticated analyses, and they are kind of an example. I think what's kind of exciting now is that we're seeing other states on our side of the country, New Jersey, for example, and is one that's been on the cusp, I think, of passing new legislation, environmental justice, and I think it's resonant with what we're trying to do over here. I think Maryland has stuff going on too, particularly in the Baltimore area, but it's not legislation in the same way. So unfortunately, I don't have a clear example that I could point to, but I'd be happy to share resources about the states that have the more developed policies. If you're interested, I'd be happy to share that.
Jeff, you're up next. If you could unmute yourself.
Jeff, you need to unmute yourself.
Oh, I thought I did. Thank you, Professor Luna. It was a terrific presentation. I especially like how you pointed out how policies result in the perpetuation of segregation and discrimination. I'm partial to direct action, and I'm hoping that this bill, if passed, will result in that. For example, I know there was a component in front of the legislature that would direct Superfund money to resiliency in EJ areas. In Salem in particular, there's parts of the point, for example, that without resiliency will not be viable in the future, in the near future. And so do you believe that this bill will result in some future action?
I think it will. As I said before, this is part of a larger bill that has a lot of climate-related issues being addressed in it, in terms of resiliency, in terms of promoting clean energy development and clean energy investment, and developing green jobs, and directing I think a lot of positive programs potentially that could be both protective, but also I think proactive in terms of trying to move us in a direction that we want to go to. I think the question of resiliency, though, is a really complicated one in terms of thinking about the communities that are exposed in some way, either near something that's hazardous potentially, or they may become hazardous over time. as things change, as the climate changes on us and risks change. I see elements of the bill as a whole that could be really productive. I think for any given particular community, that's a little less clear about how that would play out on the ground. But I think what we're looking for here are tools that will allow us to do more than what we can do currently. And as Pat said at the beginning, legislation would lend a lot more force to some programs that were already in place in some ways, to kind of move us along a little better. I don't know specifically whether it would change for the community in Salem, that particular situation. So I can't speak to that specifically, but I think that overall it's a positive move.
Can I call people's attention to the chat? And in the chat, Cindy Lupi, from the New England Director of Clean Water Action, has shared the exciting news about New Jersey, that the Senate and the House in New Jersey passed an environmental justice bill, and it is now on the governor's desk awaiting signature. And he promised, as Cindy pointed out, on Juneteenth, in solidarity, that he would sign the bill if it reached his desk. So we're waiting with bated breath. The bill passed both houses of the legislature last week, and I'm sure Cindy can probably tell us more about that. Thanks, Cindy.
Darlene, if you could unmute yourself, you're next.
Thank you. I'm technologically challenged and could not get in there. I had this environmental justice very tangled in my mind with the greening of the gateway cities. I know that this has been a tremendous effort to get to the environmental justice legislation, but those of us who are looking forward to the tree planting that's supposed to happen in Salem, I still don't have a good feel for who the players are and how we interact with it and make it a success and learn from other people's experience so that we do make a good success of it. Can you explain the interrelation between the two pieces?
I don't know how those are related specifically, those programs, so I can't speak to that. I don't know if anyone else does.
Lupi, can you speak to that?
At a conceptual level, yes. I think the important issue here, it's an important principle of environmental justice, that communities over time who have borne the greatest burden of pollution, and in these interrelated ways that Professor Luna laid out so very well, that those communities be at the front of the line for access to the green economy and for programs that will lead to improvements on the ground in their infrastructure, in quality of life, in reducing health burdens. So there are a number of pieces of both the Senate bill and with this pending in the House. It'll just be very interesting to see what comes out of the conference committee that we're going to talk about a little bit later tonight, that can actually, with an environmental justice focus and frame, have explicit resources dedicated to really moving forward with clean transportation, clean public transit, clean energy, green infrastructure, things that will not only reduce pollution burdens, but also open up access to green jobs and green careers for low income and communities of color. So, there's a lot that is still pending and that will get figured out by the conference committee, which has until the end of the year, till I think January 1st, to come out with a final policy that aligns the House and Senate bills. But the concept is definitely one that is embedded deeply in environmental justice principles, and it's something that a number of legislators have been really interested in moving forward. So the only issue is we don't quite have a final bill that really crosses T's and dots I's on what will be happening in Massachusetts. And I also I'd be very interested, of course, all the legislators who are in the mix have had, wonderful things to say and move forward and been a part of advancing the debate. So it's really clear, particularly following this moment in time with COVID really hitting environmental justice communities hard, with economic fallout really hitting environmental justice communities hard, with pollution adding to these burdens, that there's a deep and growing focus, I think, in public policy circles, the legislature, and within this administration as well, to keep the focus here. So, long answer to a really good question. Conceptually, there are some potential places in these bills as they come together where extra resources could be reserved for environmental justice communities, assuming that different pieces and parts of the Senate and House bill come together. That would be the interim answer as this still gets worked through the conference committee.
Joan Lovely, you're next.
Thank you. I just have a kind of a paradoxical question. Dr. Luna, excellent presentation. Thank you. Have you ever seen a community or organizations or factions within a community who don't want to see any more development, even good development, because of increase in traffic density, use this as a way to stop that development, even though the community might want it?
So I have not seen a situation that I would characterize that way. Most of the communities that I've worked with or that I've observed, it was really abundantly clear that what was going on was either going to add to a burden. I mean, in terms of environmental health, typically not. Traffic, oddly, does not come up like that too often in these particular contexts I've looked at. It's usually concerns about some kind of immediate physical threat from the development itself, some kind of facility or something. And then the other thing is that I think the concern about quality of life changes that could happen with the development, which I think most communities share, that concern when anything new happens in the community. I think that's kind of background that to any kind of proposal. And so whether or not this policy could be used as a tool for enabling that kind of behavior, I can't predict. I just haven't seen that play out that way. I think, to be honest, what usually happens, at least in communities that fit the bill in terms of environmental justice as we understand it, participation is really hard to generate because these communities are often under-resourced. They're often ignorant of how to interact with the system, how to talk to officials, how to even engage. And a lot of times they're even suspicious of participation, that it'll lead to anything. So if anything, I think that's, it's remarkable when a community rallies to coordinate against something that they don't like, at least in these types of communities. And they require a lot of assistance to do that. And so a lot of the greatest victories, I would say, in terms of protecting the community have happened because of, the contributions to, by advocates who come in and help, and by resources that are brought in. But I think the other thing too to remember is that this bill has very limited control over outcomes. So it really gives communities an opportunity to participate in the process, but it doesn't necessarily say what will happen. And so the other thing too is that, this is going to apply to state processes. So it's not going to get triggered when a housing development comes in, or like a new building or a new apartment complex. It's going to get triggered when the state wants to change a highway over, on-ramp or off-ramp, or extend a rail, or, it's something really big and significant. It's going to really involve this particular bill as it's written. So, there's a variety of reasons I'm thinking out loud really about what might happen if I'm answering your question correctly.
Thank you.
Marcos, I had a question from a participant who wanted to know if you would be willing to make your slides available to
Sure.
people who participated. Okay, so we will try to do that through SAFE, make it available, or maybe Marcos, you could send me a link if you could put them in a Dropbox.
Yep.
And send me a link, and I will send it out to everybody here whose email address we have. And if we don't have your email address and you would like it, I'd like to suggest that you request the slides by sending us an email at salemsafe@gmail.com. I think we're trying to get that email address up. Cindy Keegan is going to do that next. There it is, right there on the screen. salemsafe@gmail.com. And if you send us an email there, we will be happy to send you the link to Professor Luna's slides that he graciously will make available to us. Thanks a lot, Marcos. And I think we've reached 7:30. I would like to thank Marcos Luna for your presentation tonight, for all that you have done for Salem throughout the years, most recently helping us map out gas leaks in the city of Salem. Was a really kind of revolutionary and extraordinary revelation. And we have on the Zoom tonight, Nathan Phillips, who was, along with Nathan Phillips, professor of Earth and Environment at Boston University, and Bob Ackley of Gas Safety, Inc. Both of them surveyed the city of Salem and came up with the data that allowed Marcos to then plot it out in Salem for us. And we'll have some exciting news from the city of Salem shortly about plotting of gas leaks and making those maps from the year 2015 through 2019 available. So now I want to turn it over to Cindy Keegan, and appropriately we'll begin with Cindy Lupi, who will talk a little bit more about this EJ bill. Cindy Keegan?
Great. So yeah, I mean, we wanted to give people an opportunity to just hear a quick update, but we're trying to still keep the meetings to as much as an hour as possible. So we'll try to keep these as short as possible. If some of you need to bow out, we'll understand, and we'll provide an update with the safe meeting minutes regarding this as well. So we were hoping that Cindy Lupi could give us a quick update on the legislation updates.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be with you. Great to see you all. And I think we have sort of teased this, a little bit already in the previous discussion. So it's a very exciting moment in Massachusetts. Both the Senate and the House have passed climate-oriented bills. The Senate's bills, package of bills passed at the end of January and include things that I know SAFE members really care a lot about, including mid-century mandates on net zero emission reductions and carbon pricing policies. Really, big priorities for SAFE, I know. And the House in the final weeks of the formal legislative session in July passed an exciting climate bill, as well as Professor Luna mentioned, with this very exciting environmental justice amendment and policy embedded in the overall bill that passed. So now the next step in the process is for a conference committee made up of 3 senators and 3 representatives to align the 2 bills and really come up with a single policy that is a mix and mingling of the 2 vehicles. So this is going to continue for we anticipate many weeks and many months. The work of the conference committee I don't know if any of the legislators on the Zoom have heard anything different, but we have heard that it might actually take through the deadline of January 1st, 2021 to come up with a final package. So the way the state of Massachusetts typically works, conference committees, they're very internal conversations to the committee. So there aren't a lot of updates from the committee. There aren't a lot of opportunities for the public to really impact the discussions. But there are a number of letters and written communication that have come from coalitions into the conference committee. Some of the legislators in both houses will be, having conversations with their members of the conference committee. A number of us yesterday had a really good check-in with folks from Senate President Spilka's office, and it was really clear that they understand and are really cognizant of how important the environmental justice provisions that passed the House bill are. There really aren't similar provisions in the Senate bill, so this will obviously be a big issue that the conference committee takes up. And similarly, I think it's really clear that the House understands that the carbon pricing provisions and the broad energy and climate provisions that passed the Senate earlier in January are really important, and they also weren't present in the House bill. So this situation is set up as a negotiation, and it's really clear that the House has a big stake in what moves forward, as does the Senate. So over the coming weeks and months, we will be, getting, a final a final package that comes out, and our hope is that this final package represents the best and brightest of what both houses have put forward, and that ultimately can get signed into law by the governor. So that's a high-level conceptual update on where we're at. It is it's an exciting moment. It's a sort of a nerve-wracking moment as well. And again, our hope is that the Senate and the House really rise to this moment in history and move forward the best pieces that are in both of these packages.
Thanks, Cindy. I'm going to ask my standard question. Is there anything that any of us should be doing at this point in time, or when might we need to do anything?
Well, it is a very good question. What's wonderful about SAFE is that you all, different members of your team are really embedded in the different coalitions that are putting statements forward. I think, your leadership as part of these coalitions is really wonderful. And so as an organization, SAFE has really laid the groundwork to have big impact. We're not sure that it does make sense to push the conference committee directly. No legislators from Salem are on the conference committee, and often we've been told that it's really local constituents that are the ones that have the most impact with some of these legislators. But there will be opportunities, I think, to help publicize these issues in the media, and just reinforce how important they are. And there will be opportunities, to weigh in with your own legislators and just reinforce how important the issues are. It is a unique time. It's not like the months before the bills passed in both houses. So it's a particular time. There aren't as direct ways to get involved. That is what I have heard on different conversations I've been part of. Of course, if any of the legislators have any additional thoughts on what they think would be a good way to engage, it's sort of
it would be helpful for all of us to hear. But in general, our understanding is that the conference committee has a very internal discussion, and it will not be sharing updates with the public. It's very, very internal. So that's the best way I can answer that anyway. Thank you, Cindy.
Great, thank you. I'm kind of on deck for a couple of these, and I'm going to make it really quick. Municipal aggregation for electricity on the North Shore. There's no particular update this month regarding that. We haven't had another meeting yet. They're trying to get that scheduled. This is a group program through MAPC and the Gloucester Town Green 2025, looking at ways to combine up perhaps multiple towns on the North Shore with a power aggregation purchase that could provide some interesting opportunities for us in the future. So stay tuned. If you're interested in that, feel free to contact me. But there's no current update on that. The Beverly-Salem Climate Action and Resiliency Plan, that has been underway, but they're now going to be opening up the community advisory committee, basically. And just to report that I have agreed to be on that as both a representative from SAFE as well as from the city of Salem. Or I should say from the city of Beverly, since I'm a Beverly resident as well. So looking forward to that first meeting, and then we'll have some more information on that. And then I don't think Esmeralda is on the call tonight. Is that right, Pat?
That's correct.
So I don't know if perhaps you might want to mention a little bit more on the electrification and Rocky Mountain Institute, since I actually missed the last meeting.
Okay, I'll just say that briefly that Salem got involved with the Rocky Mountain Institute following the passage, well, actually in late spring, following the passage in November in Brookline of their ban on gas, the building of new gas infrastructure in the town of Brookline. The Attorney General of Massachusetts ruled in late July that that was an illegal maneuver on the part of the town of Brookline, although Attorney General Maura Healey said that she generally agreed with that issue. So Rocky Mountain Institute offered to now over 12 municipalities in Massachusetts an opportunity to be part of a building electrification accelerator. Salem is one of those cities. Jeff Cohen, who is on this call, who is vice chair of CERC, and CERC, John Hayes, who is the chair of CERC, submitted to our city council sort of in tandem a green building ordinance. And Rocky Mountain Institute is helping us look at that green building ordinance. And one of the goals that we would be having is not to ban gas, but to push the city of Salem and in fact push the state to have a plan for gas rather than thinking about just banning gas. So that's where we're at with that. I'll just say briefly that about the Gas Leaks Allies, that Bonnie Bain, who is on this call, and I have been participating in the Gas Leaks Allies. And just today, excuse me, we realized that one of the issues that the Gas Leaks Allies are interested in reviving and putting new energy into is the issue of gas leaks and gas leaks killing trees. So that is of deep interest to us in the city of Salem. And I know Darlene Mellis, who is on who is the chair of our city tree commission, is deeply interested in that as well. So that's all I have for updates and them, and we'll have fuller reports in the minutes of the meeting.
All right, thank you. I wanted to, the last slide I had on here is some upcoming events that people might be interested in. Keynote being, our next SAFE meeting will be October 1st at 6:30. So we hope that those that joined us this evening will join us again. But there's many different things coming up. We'll try to keep you folks posted. You'll see that Salem Tree Commission on there. You'll see the CERC meeting coming up and a couple of different household hazardous waste, electronics, recycling, and then the coastal cleanups that are being sponsored by Spur and Sustainable Marblehead as well. So they're actually looking at doing those beyond just Marblehead this year, but several other communities, including Salem. So it would be nice to join forces and do that. I did have a question about if we have a date yet for when there might be further communications within the city council meetings about the green building ordinance. Because I wasn't sure if that had been slotted yet or not. So I don't know if maybe Jeff Cohen, if you know that where that stands, if you could give us an update on that or not.
Well, right now, Meg Riccardi, who I thought was on the call, I'm not sure she is, but she's the one who put it in front of the council and moved successfully for it to be in front of the Public Health, Safety, and Environment Committee. And so once we know the date of that, and there's been people behind the scenes, as Pat was talking about, trying to coordinate some efforts, and including the city, the planning and building departments will weigh in. But as soon as we know the date of that meeting, we'll let people know.
Great. I just wanted to make sure I hadn't missed it. I didn't see it in the Salem calendar, but wasn't sure if I had just passed it by. So thank you for that update. So with that, if there's anybody else that has any updates, I guess, that they might want to add to this upcoming events, I'm happy to add them in for the meeting notes so that people know about them. And otherwise, I think we're complete. Is there any other additions that folks want to add on or something they'd like to say? I can't see the chat box because I'm presenting on the screen, so. All right. Pat, I think I would like to ask if the SAFE board members could stay on the call briefly, and everyone else, we hope you have a beautiful weekend. Nice long one. Looks like it's going to be a gorgeous one, and stay healthy and safe.
Thank you all for coming. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Take care. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Marcus.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marcos. It was great to get more clarity about that. And we probably need more than a primer to go at this. But we appreciate all of the...
As long as Cindy's there to back me up, then we're okay. So that was...
Cindy and David, the techno whizzes for SAFE. Thank you.
Well,
Thank
and Cindy
you.
Loopy too, to tell us more on the legislation. So it was perfect.
Oh,
The
yeah.
two Cindys.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you,
Marcus.
Marcos. You're great. We appreciate it so much all the
All right.
time.
Oh, and you can use that link that I sent you just use the same link. It'll stay stable. So
Perfect.
for the PowerPoint. Yep. Okay.
Thank you
All right.
so much.
Good night.
Okay. Good night.
Right.
Thank you, Marcos.
I just wanted to double check. It looks like somebody else has left the room and hasn't left, so I don't know what to do with them. But I just wanted to double check if you had gotten answers from everybody about the couple of things you had asked us to vote on. And if you didn't, I figured this was a good opportunity.
Yeah. No, I don't know who Lois Sargent is, but it doesn't make much difference. I did not tally up all of the responses about that, but Cindy, I think it would be great if you shared with people what you put in writing about your concerns about that, about those 2 sign-on letters.
So yeah, remind me what I put out.
Yeah, one thing was about the raising the taxes on profitable corporations.
Yeah, well, so that was just because I was feeling like, oh gee, can I even officially do that with my company in such trouble?
Yeah. But your company is not probably one of the profitable ones.
Yeah, we'll see. That's going to be a question mark. I think that's going to be the hard part. And that was one of my questions, right? Was that there was a lot of factors in there of here's how much money we're going to raise. And my concern was that, are they really factoring in how many companies are not going to be profitable this year? But, you know, I think ultimately there's not really much choice.